So we're kind of going to step up our game a little bit here and use some nicer paper. And we're going to introduce white ink and gouache and also toned paper. So I really fell in love with the blue tone paper, something that I kind of lifted from Albrecht Dürer, who lifted it from artists while he was traveling throughout Europe. And the blue tone just offers a really soothing, nice color. And obviously you guys can take this example and create your own recipes. But what I wanted to do with you guys is walk you through the first step in this project, and that is to prepare your paper. I'm going to use Arch's watercolor paper. This is hot press 300 gram. They make heavier weight papers, but this is pretty much your standard hot press for this brand. It comes in this weight on these blocks. So the first thing to do is to get a page out. And because we're going to be laying down tone here, the oils in your fingers will actually show up when you're putting a wash. So we're trying to avoid that. So I just typically try not to touch the paper at all. And today, which I usually don't do, but I figured it's probably wise, I'm just using a paper towel so that I can handle the paper. Maybe if you have gloves that you have sitting around, like nitrile or something, just wear that glove and just hold at the very edges, you know. And I'm using a palette knife to release the paper from this wax edge. Because most people, the watercolor block is great for painting on site because this waxy edge right here, this holds all the papers together in a block so that the idea is that you can paint with water medium on top of it, and the paper won't just warp and stretch, that it'll actually stay locked down to the block itself because it has a cardboard backer. And I think I went over this in the materials, but I'll show you again. There's actually a little entry point right here, this white point. And what you do, and there's instructions on the back of the block too, tons of YouTube videos, stuff like that, is you slip your instrument inside like this, and then you just gently work your way around the perimeter until you can kind of pull the page off. So I'll put this aside. The next step is just to tape this thing down. So make sure you have a rigid surface, right? I use my drafting table. I just go right on top of it. You want to lay your paper down and tape it down. So I have my tape, my blue painter's tape. It's pretty standard. I mean, I just buy this stuff from Home Depot. I also have really nice white artist tape, but that stuff is so expensive that I try not to use it all that much for things like this. So you can measure a border if you want, but I just sort of eyeball it. And I also found that it's kind of nice to have this white border all the way around. Just aesthetically, it looks good to me personally. But we're taping it down because this paper is going to warp and flex and do all sorts of stuff. So papers have something called size in them, and that size is there to keep the fibers together. Like it's what gives the paper its structure in a way. And the more moisture and the more water that the paper takes on, the more that size gets diluted. So what we're trying to do is not get too much water on this surface because we don't want to wash away all that sizing. And this is something that I kind of did a lot of research online from artists, going on artist forums and things like that, trying to figure out the different methods. I used to use gum Arabic paper tape and stuff, and I tried all these different methods, and I wasted tons. I'm not kidding, like hundreds of dollars worth of paper I've wasted in my life doing stuff like this. So I'm going to show you the method that I kind of just landed on, that I just use over time and time again, and I get good results. So you don't have to do your own research. You can just watch me take notes and follow along, and this process is pretty reliable. And so what I'm doing right now, you can use your fingernails if you have them. I'm not scoring the paper, but what I'm doing is I'm making sure that all these little moments where the paper is bridging a gap between the surface of the paper and the surface of my support below, I'm trying to tuck that tape in so that's making as much contact as possible. And that's really important because water just will get into any tiny little crevice, right? It'll just work its way in. So just take a little bit of time receiving these air bubbles. You typically don't want this sort of stuff to be so prominent. So just take a little bit of time here. I know it feels a little bit tedious, but this is the sort of process where the more time and care that you take, the better your results will be, and you'll save money because this paper is not cheap. And I think I said in the materials list that I wanted you to buy these watercolor blocks, but I know they're quite expensive. They can kind of be intimidating to draw on because they're so expensive, and just the cost, can become sort of a distraction for many reasons. So if you want, you can also just buy loose leaf hot press watercolor paper from your local art store, or sometimes I used to just buy it online and they'll ship it in a box. You can do that and just tear the paper or cut the paper down into the size that you want. So you're not spending 50, 60, 70, 80, whatever, however much this thing costs, because there's different size watercolor blocks. We're using a 12 by 16 inch. But you can just get a loose leaf paper, and then you're not committed to dropping so much cash up front. So one layer is usually pretty good, but what I've resolved to do is use cheaper tape and kind of do like a safety layer. And you'll notice it'll happen that the tape might want to come up a little bit as it's getting wet, as it's taking on moisture. So if you have the means, I would just use the nicer, stronger tape again for this second layer, but right now we'll just do it this way. And some people, for their watercolors, they'll even staple it to a board. They'll have a plywood board that's been finished and sealed, and they'll literally just like staple gun their paper to it. So there's all sorts of methods. It's basically just whatever feels good for you and whatever is repeatable, because that's what's important. Is the process repeatable, And again, I'm just trying to lock everything down. Okay. And what I've done is I've used one of these cups, one of these measuring cups, to check out how much water I've used. So in this case, this is pre-mixed, but I'm going to go over it with you. I'm going to put this aside. This was 10 ounces of water. And the mixing kind of takes a little bit of time to get it really even. So what I'll do is I'll just go through the motions, and then I'll bring out that solution when I actually apply the tone. So here's 10 ounces. Again, this is something that oftentimes I would just feel my way through, but since we're trying to give you a process that there's no guessing, I took the time to sort of measure this stuff out. This is difficult to measure though, without being so OCD and maybe getting like a teaspoon or something. But what I wrote down is 2 inches, a 2-inch little snake. And this is Cotman's Phthalo Blue. It's cheap watercolor, but it's a beautiful color. So what I'll do is I'll just stand above and I'll just squirt it in there. So that's like 3/4 of an inch. That's about it right there. And you can modify this, to your liking a little bit. That may have even been a little too much blue, but we can just add a little bit of water. So the idea is I'm going to take a cheaper brush because I'm going to be pretty aggressive with this. So this is a student grade, again, Cotman, right? This is Winsor & Newton's student grade art material. Very, very cheap. And what I'm doing is I'm just really mixing it around, and you can hold it up to light, but I'm dabbing it, see? I'm dabbing it, dabbing it, dabbing it. And you can have a scrap piece, What I do for like my nice papers is I never throw them away. So even if I have a little bit of paper left over that I've cut off or something that didn't, go my way and I kind of abandon the drawing, I'll save it and I'll use a white part. I'll flip it over if the front's been toned, or I'll cut away a white part and I'll just keep it because they're great for assessing your wash. And they're great for assessing like when you're doing ink drawings and stuff like that. It's good to have scrap paper laying around. So never throw your nice papers away. Just keep them in like a flat file or something, or store them somewhere like under your bed, who knows, wherever you can. Okay, so this is what I was doing this morning. I'm seeing, at what point will these blue streaks, see how I'm getting these blue streaks of real concentrated watercolor? I want to avoid that because I don't want to drag that onto my paper, right? So I'll just keep doing this until I find that whenever I lay some medium down, that there's not some concentrated pigment stuck in the brushes or something. Okay, so that's kind of where I want to be with my blue. You'll notice how light it is. So this wash is actually going to be built up of a series of layers. And that's something else that I found out. It took me a long time to realize that because I had this one page that I really liked and I couldn't understand it. I kept trying to reproduce it with just one layer, just one tone layer. And I could never do it until finally I just started experimenting with multiple layers of a weaker dilution. So now that I have my blue, I want to modify the blue just a little bit, give it a little bit more value, but I don't want to try to attempt to alter value by just adding more blue and making the blue more and more intense. So what I do is I take my black ink, I'm using Repeatograph here because they have a nice little dropper, and I'm only going to do 2 drops, right? Just 2 drops. There's one drop, 2. That's all you need. I was a little bit out of frame there, I think, for a second, but you didn't really miss anything. Just 2 drops. Be careful about that. And then just give it a mix. And then I come back here and I just say, okay, now it's clearly that phthalo blue, but it's got a little bit of it's kind of darkened up a little bit. Now the color feels more complex to me. So a couple things to note about doing these washes, okay? You want to use a tray. You want to use a tray that's pretty wide and flat. So if you save your like Chinese takeout or Thai or whatever you eat that gives you those little disposable black or clear trays, they're usually like 2 inches deep. That's good. You want a shallow dish to use. And I'm using a 3-inch brush right here for this. Okay, 3-inch brush. It's nice and big. These are cheap too. You can find them in just about any art store. Nothing fancy. And what I'll do, it's a little bit wet because I was using it earlier, but when it's dry, what I'll do is I'll slap it on the edge of the table. So I'll do this over and over and over again. So what I'm doing is I'm trying to free up the hairs because I'm trying to reduce the amount of hairs that drop off into the page. And if they do drop off, don't touch them. It's not a big deal. Just let them dry there. Don't put your finger in there, okay? It's better just to have a tiny little hair that might have water drying around it than a fingerprint dragged through your wash, okay? Okay, so as I'm doing this, I'm going to talk a little bit about assessing your tones, right? Because you'll probably want to experiment with your own colors. With washes, okay, they typically go down looking darker than they'll dry. They'll go down darker, wet, and then they'll dry lighter, okay? So they'll dry lighter when you're anticipating this stuff. Again, this is why test it on a small sheet, okay? Try to test as much as you can on something before your final nice sheet. But anyways, to help guide you, it'll dry lighter. The other thing to note, besides that, is that color plays tricks on our eyes. When you do your test on a small swatch, you'll say to yourself, oh, okay, yeah, that's really light. It's a really light color, right? Light value. So then you'll apply it to your piece here, and what you'll find is that that color appears to be darker and more intense as it's applied to a bigger field. A lot of homeowners run into this stuff, right? They're going to repaint their kitchen. They go to Home Depot and they look at these tiny little 2-inch swatches and they say, oh yeah, this color is really beautiful. It's light, it's pastel, la 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 la. And then they'll paint their whole kitchen with it, and it's like this oppressive color. It's just everywhere. It's so strong. So that's just kind of a phenomenon that you have to take into account as you're doing this. Always err on the side of staying lighter than you think. So this is my first layer, and if you can see what I'm doing, I'm going in both directions. I'm going side to side, back and forth, and I'm being very gentle, and I'm just letting the brush keep a nice flat edge. See how I'm alternating each time? Alternating. And we're not pressing, I'm just dragging the very tip, and it'll just drop off color. Okay. So I'm going to let that sit for a second. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab my blow dryer. Okay, so I have my blow dryer. And I know I said before to avoid using like really hot air, but I tested this one. And even on the hot setting, it's just kind of warm. So I'm going to use the hot setting and not worry about causing too much disruption in those fibers, because again, extreme heat changes, right? It'll mess up the paper. So let's see, you're gonna lose my audio a little bit, but what I'm gonna do is you'll see me, I'm gonna go in motions like this all the way around, back and forth, back and forth. I'm not gonna be right up on it like this, okay? Not right here. I'm gonna keep it like 6 inches away at least, just like this. And I'm just kind of going over. Okay, so you might be asking yourself, when do I stop blow drying this, for instance? What I was looking for is, I was looking for the paper to get flat again, because you'll notice when you apply your wash that it'll start to get really warped, and you're gonna panic a little bit. You're gonna say, oh my God, like it's warping, I don't know what to do. Just trust in the paper that the sizing, it'll help it just, as it dries, it'll come back. It'll be like a drum. It'll come right back to shape. Eventually, when we finish everything, the paper will be wavy a little bit. So what I do sometimes is I just press it under a bunch of books. Like I'll take a flat piece of wood or something, and I'll put heavy books on top, and I'll let it sit overnight. So this was my first layer. And I don't want to sit here and make you watch paint dry, because that's not entertaining and that's not really that informative. But I did want you to see kind of the way I apply the wash. I just dipped it a heavy coat, and it just kind of brushed out the excess liquid, but I could feel in the weight of the brush that it was fully loaded. It just wasn't super saturated to the point that it's dripping. And then you just gently, right, you just go back and forth, back and forth. So I'll repeat this process 3 times. This is my first coat, and then I'll apply another one, blow dry it the same way. It'll get wavy again, and then as I blow dry it, it'll get tight. And then I'll put a third wash. So with this specific dilution, 3 passes is what's necessary for me to get a tone that I feel comfortable with, that feels good. So let's say that this is my final tone, right? I'm done. Super simple, just to take off the tape. And again, you really want like a pretty clear workstation. I don't think I mentioned that before, but you really want to clear everything off your drafting table, whatever you're using. You really just want it the paper, right? Because you're trying to avoid spills. So with this, what you're just doing is you're just really delicately pulling the tape back. I know this is like, it's probably fairly obvious, but I've torn paper myself by being impatient and just ripping paper or ripping tape off. So just, firmly and gently just pull the tape off. And yeah, that's about all there is to it. So I'm kind of just made a really easy recipe, a really easy process for you guys after having looked at so many hours and so many different people's processes involving so many different types of tools. But you can do this so simply. You just need tape, some cheap watercolor, some cheap brushes, and a flat surface and some watercolor paper. Okay, so here is the paper that I prepared earlier. Here's the one we just did. So you can see it's a little wavy, right? A little wavy. It's not a big deal though. It's not going to affect you. And if we had more time, I'd probably press this and leave it for a day. Once you finish your drawing, it still might be a little bit wavy, even just after a day of letting it sit. So when I store these papers, I generally store them flat, and then I have something not too heavy, but just on top, and it'll keep them flat forever. So you can see the difference. One layer, one pass, 3 passes. Not too dark. And the reason why I'm really stressing that we get to about this value right here is because when we use white ink, the white ink won't really pop that much. See, if I put the white down right on top of this, the white ink really won't bring your drawing forward because this value, our background value, is a little too light. So when we're at this level, with this blue, if I put white down, you can see that a highlight will really stand out because this is going to serve as our like basic default light value right here. That way, when we're drawing with pen and ink, brush and ink, whatever, you don't have to load up the page with tons and tons and tons of ink to segregate like even a half light from a highlight. This way, I can pretty much just draw into the shadows and a little bit into the light mass, but I can let the blue be that default value, and then I can just apply a little bit of white to my highlights. And it makes for a really nice effect, and it also kind of teaches you how to think where you can anticipate how am I going to bring my drawing forward, how am I going to make moments really pop, because we really haven't touched on highlights all that much. So that'll be something that we'll introduce with this one, how to navigate your highlights and how to use them and not abuse them. So now that we've done this, I think we're ready to start getting into the self-portrait.
There is a lot of value in online art education. We have so much great instruction on NMA that is so easily accessible. Even when I was in school learning to draw and paint, nothing was online. Wherever you are in the world, you can get this instruction. And not only can you watch these lessons that are so valuable and so in-depth and so passionately instructed, but you can watch them again and again and again.